These were the first, the embattled farmers, as the poet Emerson called them. At Concord Bridge, they fired the shot heard round the world. They began their adventure as a group of individuals united at first only by something intangible in the emerging American spirit, a sense of the importance of independence, a belief that a man should have something to say about his own affairs. The Continental Congress gave their struggle a direction that was breathtaking in its audacity and sweeping in its vision of man's rights. Not mere rebellion, the creation of a new and uniquely free nation. Destiny provided a leader to match the peril and need of the time. And under him, through 8 years haunted with incredible hardship, were shaped the victories of Trenton and Saratoga, and finally, of Yorktown. The dream of American liberty at last took life. A constitutional bedrock of political morality and religious freedom gave this dream a base, an anchor for the soaring aspirations of generations to come. The acquisition of vast new lands through the Louisiana Purchase provided room for a period of vigorous growth. The people used the peaceful years to settle new territories. But before the nation was 30 years old, war came again. The War of 1812. In this conflict with the British, the central issue was the rights of American seamen, and the war was primarily a naval one. The Battle of New Orleans was the only important action by ground forces in this war, and it was actually fought after the war was officially over. Here, the Army learned more about military tactics. The nation learned something about its need for a professional army to stand ready against attack. And the attacking forces learned the folly of underestimating the stubborn resourcefulness of men defending their freedom. Now there followed nearly half a century of expansion as the nation's frontier was pushed ever farther and farther westward. In retrospect, the simple confidence of those pioneers in the face of the hardships, uncertainties, and dangers which lay before them is amazing. And their achievement, a lasting and inspiring heritage. Americans had begun the work of making a continental United States a reality. Now Texas wrote a preface to the next chapter in America's history, and a mission compound whose name might otherwise have become merely an obscure historical footnote became a synonym for endurance and heroism. This was the Alamo. Texas won its independence after a long and bloody struggle, during which a band of 187 Americans met death and won enduring fame at the Alamo. The frontiers expanded, and the flow of the nation's commerce grew. The midpoint of the 19th century was reached and passed in peace. But as the late 1850s approached, a storm of violent opinion was building, which would threaten the very unity of the nation. The most tragic of all wars, that of brother against brother, was forced upon the nation. Soldiers of both sides went into battle secure in the belief in their cause. The Confederate soldier had behind him the unified effort of a culture that was actually a way of life. He also had a superb military organization. Perhaps more than these, he had a hot, defiant pride, a formidable confidence that he would win. He fought with a magnificence that did him high credit. And in the end, it was not his spirit or skill, but his resources that failed him. The Union Army suffered at first from overconfidence and a lack of unity. But in the refining fire of combat, these were done away. And by mid-war, the Union soldier emerged as one of the most effective fighters in military history. This war was many things. It was the first modern war in terms of weaponry, transport, technology. It was a war of spectacular plans, brilliant in their execution. Its campaigns still provide lessons for students of tactics. In human terms, the war was a national tragedy. Viewed historically, it preserved the nation. Today, a battlefield like Gettysburg becomes a many-acred national shrine where silence and memory command the ground so torn by the fury of shot and shell a century ago. Where living men fought and suffered, bronze and stone now stand, sentinels of a nation's conscience, telling over and over for every succeeding age how dearly bought is the unity which makes this nation one and indivisible. And at Arlington, a memorial to the Civil War dead expresses what might be said of all American soldiers of every war. Not for fame or reward, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. America's advancement, once again made secure through the courage and sacrifice of her fighting men, stretched into the West and into the future with limitless promise. The two great oceans were to be linked. The continent was to become one great nation in geographical as well as philosophical fact. The great reach westward was met by the West reaching eastward. All this did not, however, go unopposed. The Indian, who had resisted the settlement of the new continent from the beginning, had grown bold and powerful while the nation was absorbed in its struggles for the Union. To the soldier fell the task of bringing safety to the Great West. It was a harsh assignment. The Army's Western forces totaled only some 10,000 men, scattered widely across the vast plains. This 10,000 faced an enemy which numbered 250,000. He did more than his duty, wrote one Army general of this soldier of the West. He did more than his duty. And in the doing, he wrote a page of history which will be read and thrilled to so long as men prize courage. Still, much of the time, as always, the soldier's duty was carried out unheralded, in tedium, hardship, and isolation. unrelieved by the excitement of combat action. Under vast skies, he did a vast job. By the end of the 19th century, the West and the internal security of the entire country were stabilized. From ocean to ocean, the American nation stretched, strong and free. The beginning of the new century brought rumblings of a much greater challenge and much farther from our shores. America hoped to remain uninvolved, but that was not to be. The doughboy went into his first European combat experience full of confidence and idealism. He was determined to save the world for democracy. It was an agonizing war of stalemate and negligible gains of ground bitterly fought for. A war of trenches and barbed wire cutting across the heart of France. New weapons brought to the battlefield a deadliness never known before. He fought well through the Holocaust of Cantigny, Chateau-Thierry, Belleau Wood, the Marne, the Argonne Forest. Steadily, stubbornly, he made his way across the torn and bloody ground. He turned the tide of battle. The price he willingly paid won him victory and an immortal place in the memory of generations of soldiers yet to come. Now came years of burgeoning industrial power, of swift development, spurred at first by the belief that the war just ended had in fact ended all war. Within 2 decades, however, this industrial might would be desperately needed. By the late 1930s, America could not mistake the shape of things to come. Knowing time might be short, the nation began to mobilize. Around a small nucleus of trained professionals, a mighty fighting force had to be built. A force that would use combat skills that were new and untried in battle so far as American troops were concerned. The enemy had shown the effectiveness of such modern skills all too clearly in Europe. By December of 1941, all time for preparation had run out. With what there was left, of what she had ready, America fought back. For some, whose stubborn resistance had bought priceless time for their country, the months ahead, in captivity, would sorely test their fortitude, their moral stamina, and their faith in the ultimate victory of their free nation. History would record that they had that fortitude, that stamina and faith, and that their faith was justified. History would record, too, how their comrades in arms devised and put into practice techniques of assault that had not been in the book, until the necessities of a global purpose called forth the needed answers. The massed amphibious assault, first perfected in the Pacific and in Italy, would be put to use later in the greatest landing ever attempted in the history of man. D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. The task which had been set for them came perilously close to being impossible. Somehow, they accomplished it. He worked with weapons which were ever more powerful, more complex, more varied and effective. His firepower had become impressive indeed. Now, the long and bitter time of fighting in Europe was over, and all attention turned to the Pacific. Intensified effort from the air reflected our wish to avoid the cruelly costly prospect of a land invasion of Japan. A new era began the morning a single bomber, instead of the usual hundreds, delivered an ultimatum. On board the battleship Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender. World War II was at an end. Hundreds of thousands came home. A great many others did not. And on far beaches lay rusting reminders of flame and bitter violence. Time and the sea would erase them, but the nation's debt to the men who brought them there would remain. The growing complexity of warfare brought changes in the Army. The variety of skills and specialties needed to support its overall mission grew, and its men kept pace with this dramatic growth. The days when a soldier needed only to keep his eyes and ears open, his mouth shut, and his rifle clean were long and permanently gone. Nevertheless, the prime mission of the soldier, to be ready to deliver swift and effective force against any threat to his nation's security, remained, and his readiness to meet any new challenge was kept sharp. In June of 1950, from among the beautiful peaks and valleys of Korea, the new challenge came, and the response was unequivocal. At the start, there were not enough of them, a familiar situation, but they used what they had to good effect. They kept victory beyond the grasp of the aggressors while reinforcements rallied. In the United States, the citizen, as always, came through. By the tens of thousands, he shouldered the responsibility for doing his part in maintaining the freedom he'd been born into. He did himself and the nation proud service when the need arose. He learned what he had to learn. He mastered the bewildering swiftness of the change from civilian to soldier.
4,
He gained the pride that comes to a group of individuals when, through hard work, they become an effective, smoothly coordinated team. In Korea, after a year of swift seesaw movement, the fighting settled into a stalemate. Constant patrolling, endless fighting over the same bits of battered earth. These taxed the soldier's endurance. Still, he kept at his job to convince the enemy that he could not win. In the end, he made his point that armed aggression against free men would be met and thwarted wherever and whenever it might appear. By the late 1950s, the soldiers' training was more widely varied than ever before in history. He learned to be at home in the steaming jungle. He mastered the equipment, the tactics, the specialized techniques required for combat in the Arctic snow. He swallowed the dust and endured the heat of desert operations, where the temperature was 115 in the shade, and there was no shade. He worked with weapons which were ever more powerful, more complex, more varied and effective. His firepower had become impressive indeed. Today, there are new challenges to be faced. Since the time of the Minutemen at Concord Bridge, much has changed. The tools, the technology, the mobility and firepower wielded by the soldier of today would seem fantastic to men who went into battle armed only with flintlocks and a stubborn dream. Much has changed, but much remains the same. Flintlocks have become museum pieces, but the dream of the men who bore them still animates their counterparts in the 20th century. The times have changed. The determination of free men to remain free has not. Today, as in the beginning, the high intent of a nation depends for its chance of fulfillment upon the man who is ready to give whatever may be needed, the soldier. He is worthy, today as then, of the grateful tribute of his people, because he is, today as then, ready. Ready to redeem in full measure the pledge which echoes and re-echoes throughout the soldier's heritage. For freedom, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
The Eager Defender is a multilateral, multi-nation exercise with the nation of Kuwait, primarily focused on the defense of Kuwait, but also contributing to the larger security of the Gulf states in the Arabian Gulf region.
This year was special because it introduced a new concept, bringing in partners from our GCC as well as the United States Army to conduct a combined exercise on Palaka Island.
Eager Defender is not just an exercise for us. It is a testament to our shared commitment for a safer world.
For the U.S. service side, it provides us in the Army to work alongside our sister services like the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force, as well as to integrate our GCC partners into our Joint Operations Center, trade doctrine, and train how we fight as a military force.
We stand ready not only to support our neighbors in the Gulf region, but also to respond to the needs across the Middle East and provide security and stability to all of our partners.
The U.S. Army Garrison Japan's Directorate of Emergency Services is getting new patrol cars for the 88th and 901st Military Police Detachments on Camp Sama.
It will drastically improve our mission capabilities. The things that most people will see is that the appearance of the military police vehicles is going to change.
Logistics Readiness Center Honshu employees are helping prep 4 of the vehicles for use, focusing now on updating the color and design of the vehicles.
Army regulations say they have to be a certain size with the lettering, color, and visual.
LRC Honshu, which follows under the 4th 3rd Army Field Support Brigade, helped the garrison procure the vehicles. Leadership from both teams work together closely in order to navigate the procurement process for a fleet life cycle replacement.
Although we may be in different units, we have one mission. Working together, we were able to bring in all the experience and knowledge and efforts to make it happen.
We did a lot of talking. We did a lot of discussion with many people. I am just happy that we managed to see the success that we did.
I'm happy because these are 2010s, 2011s, so they're not terribly old, but we drive them all the time and we work 12-hour shifts. So I think it just takes a toll on them. So I'm just glad that our command has gotten us new vehicles to drive.
Whatever you need to get the job done, they're 100% full support.
The LRC Honshu team will also install police package equipment that consists of emergency lights, sirens, and radios on these patrol cars. And they said 8 more vehicles will be coming in soon.
We will continue to work with Garrison and fight for additional money, funding to replace the remaining vehicles and to fill all of our authorizations. And then we'll move on to the next project to enhance this community.
For U.S. Army Garrison Japan Public Affairs, I'm Aya Watsushi.
Welcome to Corpstruction, the podcast of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm here today with Kim Sorrells. Kim is a design manager in the hydropower section of the engineering branch of our engineering division here at the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Kim, for taking the time to sit down with us and talk about what you do here at the Tulsa District on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you.
So, Kim, tell us about what a design manager in hydropower does.
So in hydropower, it's the same as if we're in the military or civil program. We basically execute the projects. So sometimes we like to describe it as herding cats. So we work with the PDT to make sure the project is developing, it's on schedule, it's within budget, everyone has the funding they need to do their job. So it's really just organizing the team to get that project execution through.
And the PDT, that's a project delivery team?
Yes.
And with regard to hydropower, what kind of projects are you working on right now?
We have a whole plethora of types of projects. We have 8 plants within the district. So our projects could be something like an intake gate, repairing that, a bridge crane. It could be a full generator rewind. So we have small projects from painting projects to large projects like a full replacement. So it comes, we work with the Hydroelectric Design Center and we give them a short list of projects, and each year they choose which projects are are funded, and we just go from plant to plant and whatever their critical needs are.
How many hydropower dams do we have in the
We have
district?
8. Sometimes we support Southwest Division or Little Rock as well.
Is there one project that's with hydropower right now that's taking up the majority of your time?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with Denison. That's kind of been the plan, just naturally. I've been working with. We just kicked off a full roof replacement for them, so that's been nice to see that from the beginning, and now moving into construction. But currently, it's the Denison wall. So they have a historic full timber truss wall out there that is in pretty bad disrepair. It's had some water infiltration and really needs full replacement. So we worked as a team to investigate whether it was worth repairing or replacing the wall. And we sent some inspection teams out there and decided as a team to replace it. So right now, our team is developing a RFP, which is a request for proposal. And we'll do a design build project and work with an AE for them to design the wall. But it's neat because we really get to use innovation on this project. Replacing the wall is interesting because it's not a regular shape. It's not just a standard straight up and down wall. It's kind of a trapezoid.
Really?
And they intended to expand the powerhouse when they built it, and it's a historic structure. So we've also had to work with the Texas Historic Commission to make sure we're doing everything in line and following. It has kind of an Art Deco style to it.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really neat plant out there, and the wall itself is beautiful. It's just it's old and it's been hit with a lot of water, so it needs to be replaced. But there's some engineering difficulty in that and trying to decide the footprint. Do we want to replace the same or try to put just a standard vertical wall in? But you've got some structural components of that you have to make sure how it fits with the existing structure and that it'll stand on its own. So it's an interesting project. And like I said, right now we're developing the RFP, but we'll work with an AE to get that designed and out there. So
What's an AE?
just an architectural engineering firm.
Okay. How'd you end up in hydro? What did you do before hydropower? Because I remember we talked back in 2020.
Yeah, right.
And you were doing the inspections of structures or evaluations of structures for potential COVID buildings or COVID medical support. What have you been up to in the last several years?
Well, I've been with the military program as a structural engineer for about 4 years, and about a year ago, almost to the day, I moved over to hydropower. So just moving into a different role on the other side of the house. And so I was doing structural engineering design. I designed the AIT building out at Fort Sill, and that's the first one should be getting close to ending construction, and they're starting the second phase of that. And I decided to move over to work with some other groups. So when I was in structures, I just worked mainly with the military design folks. Now I get to work with acquisition planning. I work with contracting. I work with PPMD. I work a little closer with the customer and the powerhouse out there, which is neat. So it's really seeing the execution side of the project, and some things I've said throughout the year. I'm new to this side, so I'm learning some of the strategy of this, but it's neat to see. I was used to just handing off the project and then whatever happens, and now I'm part of that, what happens, and making sure it actually gets awarded and goes to construction.
Is that fulfilling?
It is. It's nice to see your work come to fruition, because it's one thing to design it on paper and do the math and calculations and drawings, but to actually see it built and work with the folks. And I think the most rewarding part is working with the powerhouse and seeing. I think the powerhouse manager out there, when we got the roof awarded, he said something like he can retire now because he never thought that project would come through. And that makes me feel great that I can work to get something done that they've needed for a while.
Yeah. And I mean, like, hydropower is so interesting because it's just got so many quote unquote moving parts, I guess. But I mean, to see when you were talking about the wall that you all are trying to get replaced, what is that, a wall in the powerhouse, or is it Oh, it is a powerhouse wall.
Yes. So it's like I said, because the footprint is kind of strange, it's on the east end of the wall. So it's almost like they just stuck a piece of plywood at the end of the powerhouse with the intent to remove it and build more concrete structure. And then probably within the last 20 years, they've decided, no, we don't need any more generators. We're not going to expand this. It was never meant to exist this long. It was built as a temporary wall. So it's full floor down to the lower level up to the top. So all in all, it's a little over 80 feet. It's a pretty big wall. But it's interesting in the construction side of it because the floors aren't necessarily aligning. So we've got some gaps and have to be a little creative on what we do there.
How do you deal with stuff like that with where you have to be quote unquote creative?
Yeah, it's interesting because we're not the ones that are designing it. So we have to describe it in a way that someone else can pick it up and understand where they need to be creative and what they need to think through. So we've been out to the site multiple times, taking pictures. We've pulled as-built drawings. Our structural engineer has layered some of those and they're a little difficult to read. So we've done some section drawings of our own to make sure it's understood clearly. And then we go through a pretty intense review process. So we hand it to someone else and to see if they can understand the way we've described it. So it's almost like a game of telephone which is hard because you're asking someone, I like the bring me a rock example. Well, if I say bring me a rock, you might bring me a boulder and I'm like, oh no, I needed a smaller rock. So we have to really describe it. It needs to be this size, it needs to be this shape, it needs to be this type of rock and very clear about those requirements and what they are. But it also gives us an opportunity to be innovative with things like materials or the type of wall, if it's kind of a prefabricated or almost like a Lego set that can be built up, or if it's a cast in place concrete. So we're intentional about the needs and parameters that we describe, and then the ability for the AE to really design and see what fits best and within budget. So it kind of makes it difficult to be an engineer sometimes because you have to work within all these boxes. But that's also fun because it's creative problem solving.
Now you're a structural engineer by
trade and 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And why structural versus say civil or electrical or any other discipline within engineering?
Yeah, I kind of accidentally landed in it. I never wanted to be an engineer. My mom always said I should be an engineer. And so, of course, I didn't want to do what my parents said I should do. And I really loved math. I was very good at math and I love science and I like to draw. And when I was in high school, I went to a presentation from OSU and it was from their architectural engineering department. And they had these renderings of these buildings that they had drawn and they were so cool. And it was just the perfect combination of what I was good at and what I loved. And I fell in love. And it was my senior year and I thought, I want to do that. I didn't realize that I had picked the hardest program probably at OSU, but that's fine. I was up for the challenge and I met some of my best friends. Actually, Laura Shootman went through the same program as I did. And there's a few other folks here in Tulsa that went through that program. And we found the AE or architectural engineering program at OSU is specifically for building structures and specifically structural engineering. So most structurals, when they go to school, they go through the civil department and then they kind of choose which area of civil that they want to go into. But mine was decided for me and I stuck through it, the 5-year program, but it's perfect because I love buildings, which I know sounds very nerdy, but I'll walk in a building and just look up immediately and appreciate the structure and how it's put together. And so mom was right. It really was what I love to do and what I was good at. And I can kind of apply those together. So,
some people say, well, you go with architectural design or whatever, architectural engineering, but you chose structural. Where are the sort of differences there between the two?
Yeah, I try not to say architectural engineering because people think that I'm an architect and it's really structural engineering. So I like to describe it as the body. So like the architects will design the outside, what you see, and then the structurals will design the bones. So you have to have something to hold up the body. So the architects kind of dream it up and we make it happen. And it's hard because architects are very creative, and some of the things that they dream up are very hard to build and make sure that is safe and will stand. So I like that challenge of it though too. But being an AE gives me the ability to be creative too, and not just design a box or something simple.
Is there a style you like particularly?
But yes, I really appreciate. I think my favorite building, it sounds weird, is the Iron Building, in New York City. It's shaped like an iron, that's why it's called that. It has kind of a 1920s. I don't think it's Art Deco, but kind of the older style. Architecture school really taught me to like straight lines and everything aligning, black and white, simple, and that's the way I like things as well. So it's hard to describe like a specific style, but it's definitely if you see like the posters I've made around, everything aligns perfectly. And they really taught us presentation in school, and that was something in engineering college we wouldn't have taken the design classes, but in AE we took almost all of the design classes that the architects take.
Wow. And that iron building, is it's shaped like an ironing board iron?
No, like an actual iron, like a triangular shape. So
Oh,
if you
okay.
look down,
Like an
and
anvil?
plan,
No,
yeah.
yeah, like an anvil.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Wow. Wow.
It's strange because on the end it gets really narrow and curved, and it would be hard to fit any kind of usable space in there. But yeah.
Now you said you've been doing structural for 15 years. Now you had a stint as a teacher,
I
though.
did, yeah.
Is that at Union?
I was at Broken Arrow for
Broken
2,
Arrow.
and then a STEM school for 1, and I took a 4-year break and taught during
You
that.
from the Corps, from you said you were at a
I worked at the private sector, and then I went to teaching, and then I came back to the private sector, and I did a year deployment with FEMA actually through my job there. And then when I came back, I ended up coming onto the Corps, which was really neat because it was kind of the perfect marriage of all of my past. The teaching applied, my work with FEMA applied, the engineering applied, and I've been able to use that here every single bout of experience I've had here.
Was that a disaster recovery or is it a disaster mission?
It was after Hurricane Irma.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. When you were teaching, why did you decide to go do that?
My parents were both teachers. I was the kid that would teach her stuffed animals when she was little. And I just always had a passion for that. I like people and I like helping people. And it's fun to me. And I get to teach math, which is really fun to me. I'm very nerdy. So
Which stuffed animal is your best student?
probably the bear. He had a tie, so he was very serious.
He was a studious bear.
Yes, he was.
What have I not asked you that I should have asked you?
I think one of the things I was thinking about earlier is if I got asked the question of what I like about being an engineer or why I wanted to be an engineer. And it comes down to helping people. And that's, you don't always think about that in engineering, and civil or structural engineering is under the civil engineering branch, which, civil is all about people. And what I do is I protect people as a structural engineer. I make sure that they go into a building that's safe, and that if anything happens to that building, they'll still be safe or find a way to exit safely. I like to describe it to my students as 9/11. And I ask them, should the building have fallen? What do you think? And we talk about that, and we talk about why it did and how me as an engineer can learn from that and be a better engineer and build a safer building, or a way to delay that so that people can get out of the building. And that's something with the Army Corps, the way we design buildings, we design them a little sturdier and to last a little differently than in the private sector. And we did that with AIT. We had to design for progressive collapse resistance. So if something happens, we delay that time so that everybody or most people can get safely out of the building. So I really look at, I'm not just designing cool buildings. I'm not just an engineer, I'm not in it for the money. But I get to know that I'm helping people and I'm helping the Army. I'm helping to make their lives better and safer.
Kim, thank you so much for taking the time. I know this was really short notice. I called you or I saw you in the elevator and I said, hey, I need to do a podcast interview with you. And you said, okay, maybe later. And then you called me back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can do it. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time. It's always great talking to you. Thank you for joining us for Corestruction. Corestruction is a production of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Public Affairs Office. This episode of Corestruction is brought to you by the Engineering Branch of the Engineering Division of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day and have a great Engineers Week.
On 20 September, almost 3 months after the North Korean communists launched their invasion, United Nations troops are in the first stages of their all-out drive toward North Korea. 5 days previously, they went from the defensive to the offensive, when U.S. Marines made an amphibious landing 150 miles behind the enemy lines at Incheon. The landing cut off the enemy from his supplies and caught him in a giant United Nations pincers. Air Force, Navy, and Marine planes give support to ground troops and cut off communist attempts to bring up reinforcements from the north and south. Exactly 3 months to the day after the city of Seoul fell to the communist invaders, UN forces recapture this South Korean capital. These are Marines and U.S. 7th Division troops advancing into Seoul under enemy fire. Street fighting rages throughout the city. The Reds have fortified many of the buildings, and red tanks may appear around any corner. It had been hoped that Seoul might be recaptured with a minimum of destruction. But this is impossible, as the Reds stage a house-to-house fight. After a 5-day battle for Seoul, General MacArthur announces the city's recapture on 26 September. There is still fighting in the city, but the main communist garrison is now fleeing to the north. UN troops rest as they close another chapter of history. At the Ashiya Air Base in Japan during the battle for Seoul, The 187th Airborne Regiment arrives from the United States. Ammunition and other supplies are loaded on unit vehicles which will be flown to Korea. The paratroopers, 2,400 strong, board C-54 transports and C-119 flying boxcars for their flight to the combat zone. Kimpo Airfield is the destination. The paratroopers are rushed to staging areas as fast as they unload. The same C-54s fly wounded back to Japan. In its first 4 days of operation, the Kimpo airlift evacuated 313 wounded to Japan. Cargo and passenger planes are coming into Kimpo at a rate of 1 every 10 minutes. Typical cargo is this disassembled 280-ton bridge. These ponton boats are part of the bridge, which was shipped entirely by air. The airfield is inspected by Air Force leaders past and present. In the group are General George C. Kenney, Commanding General, Air University, Lieutenant General George C. Stratemeyer, Commanding General, U.S. Far East Air Forces, and General Carl Spaatz, retired, former commander of the U.S. Air Force. In the background is a captured Yak fighter plane found in good condition. Now land-based at Kimpo are Marine carrier planes aiding in the tactical support of ground forces north of Seoul. This F-7F Tiger Cat night fighter proves especially valuable during this stage of the fighting north of Seoul. F-7Fs are equipped with radar and are very effective against convoys and troop concentrations at night and in bad weather. These Tiger Cats and Corsairs are being loaded with 5-inch rockets for a strike near Seoul. As UN troops liberate South Korean territory, they find more and more appalling evidence of mass atrocities committed by the Reds. On 6 October, it is estimated that 25,000 South Korean men, women, and children, as well as United States soldiers taken prisoner, have been massacred by the retreating Reds. Bodies are found in many different areas, many having been killed by clubbing and burning, as well as by shooting. One of the largest mass graves is found at Daejeon, where 6,000 atrocity victims are uncovered. When the fighting ends in Korea, these scenes will be evidence for a war crimes investigation. October 17 is a suspenseful day for the U.S. 1st Cavalrymen as they advance into the outskirts of Pyongyang, capital city of North Korea. The city is known to be heavily fortified, and it is expected that the Reds will make a death stand for their capital. It is reported that the Reds have 30,000 men defending Pyongyang. tropical typhoon hits the U.S. Sakai Army base in Japan. With rain and wind ranging up to 110 miles per hour, it is the worst storm to hit Japan in 16 years. Corrugated metal roofing flies through the air like paper. Most of the tile, shingle, and corrugated metal roofs are damaged. The concrete structures withstand the storm well, although windows are broken and there is water damage. There are no military casualties from the storm since most of the troops remain indoors in the stronger buildings, safe from the falling trees and power lines. But among the Japanese in the storm's path, 135 are killed, over 1,000 injured, and over 200,000 made homeless. The heaviest military damage is suffered by wooden and tar paper buildings. These tropical storms are expected near the Sea of Japan at this time of the year. October 17 is a suspenseful day for the U.S. 1st Cavalrymen as they advance into the outskirts of Pyongyang, capital city of North Korea. The city is known to be heavily fortified, and it is expected that the Reds will make a death stand for their capital. It is reported that the Reds have 30,000 men defending Pyongyang. Another Red is added to the 75,000 captured so far. A vehicle burns beside the road. Ammunition explodes in the fire. The attack is led by tanks as the 1st Cavalry advances under fire toward the center of the city. The railroad guides them. Then, surprisingly, the enemy fire weakens as U.S. infantrymen reach the heart of the city. The Reds are withdrawing. Although there is occasional rear guard fire and sniper activity, the main Red force has begun to flee northward in disorganization. A company medic gives first aid to a cavalryman wounded in the street fighting. As the 1st Cavalrymen overrun the city, South Korean troops join them. The ROK forces met heavy resistance on the east side of town, but finally fought their way through after 6 hours. They are following the retreating enemy northward. An estimated Red force of 30,000 is now fleeing Pyongyang. South Koreans and 1st Cavalrymen join forces, decide their zones of action, and move on. In the eastern area of Pyongyang, near the Taedong River, the South Koreans encounter a pocket of enemy rear guard troops and pause to wipe them out. Only small arms fire is necessary, as the river is crossed by bridge and assault boats. As UN forces take over the city, the North Korean Communist government has vanished, presumably having fled north across the Manchurian border. The heavily fortified capital of Korean communism is now under the United Nations flag. Shortly after the paratroopers take their positions, they are joined by tanks of the 1st Cavalry Division, which have pushed through from Pyongyang. As these forces join, the last remnants of the Red Army are compressed into an area only 50 miles from the Manchurian border. As UN forces take the North Korean capital at Pyongyang, a new threat to the Reds gets underway at Kimpo Airfield. Paratroopers of the 187th Airborne Regiment plan to jump ahead of the Reds fleeing Pyongyang, cutting off their escape route to the border. The planes are C-47 transports and C-119 boxcars. There are over 4,000 men in this operation, which consists of 2 separate drops on 20 and 21 October. The destination is a point 33 miles north of Pyongyang, where the Reds are fleeing through the towns of Sukchon and Suncheon. And here they go. The paratroopers bail out in waves from a dozen planes at a time. On the ground, there is practically no opposition. The attack comes as a complete surprise. Watching the jump is General MacArthur, who flew here from Japan to observe this first airborne operation of the Korean War. Flying over the attack area in his Constellation, the United Nations commander stated, "This closes the trap on the enemy." Of particular interest in this drop is the parachuting of heavy equipment, vehicles, and artillery. The equipment drop takes place 10 minutes after the personnel have landed. Most of the material lands without damage, and the paratroopers rush out to put it into action. Transportation found available on the scene is pressed into service. Although the big jump was delayed at the start by bad weather, it moves like clockwork once it gets underway. Casualties are few. Out of the 4,064 men who made the 2 jumps, only 90 men are listed as jump casualties, and most of these consist of broken legs and sprains. Evacuation is rapid. Specially equipped helicopters land to carry the wounded, and they are quickly on their way back to the hospitals. Shortly after the paratroopers take their positions, they are joined by tanks of the 1st Cavalry Division, which have pushed through from Pyongyang. As these forces join, the last remnants of the Red Army are compressed into an area only 50 miles from the Manchurian border. On 17 September at Busan Air Base, a transport plane arrives with the first big-name entertainer to visit the troops in Korea. Al Jolson, often billed as the world's greatest entertainer, is in the midst of his last road tour. A veteran of years in show business and months of entertaining troops in World War II, in Europe, Africa, India, and the South Pacific, Al Jolson disregarded his doctor's warning and at the age of 64 set out to entertain troops in hospitals and at the Korean battlefront. In front of the audience he liked best, Jolson gives one of his last performances. GI audience enjoys his act. Al entertained Korean War casualties in Japan before arriving in Korea, and already has used up much of the seemingly boundless energy which he put into every performance. It was impossible for Al Jolson not to give out with all his energy and all his heart. His gaiety and rhythm was infectious, and he knew it could bring joy to others. On 23 October, 6 days after he gave this performance, Al Jolson died from a heart attack in San Francisco. One of his last acts in Korea was to raise a United Nations flag. During the month covered by this combat bulletin, the United Nations drive into North Korea moved ahead with surprising rapidity. On 20 September, UN forces were fighting in the outskirts of Seoul, fanning south from the Incheon landing and breaking out of their old beachhead. By 5 October, Republic of Korea troops had crossed the 38th parallel and were 55 air miles beyond the imaginary border between North and South Korea. On the west, U.S. troops were meeting some resistance north of Seoul. United Nations forces, including U.S., British, and Australian troops, were regrouping in expectation of a full-scale drive across the parallel after the United Nations voted approval for General MacArthur to send his troops into North Korea. By 20 October, communist forces were staggering, throwing off their uniforms and surrendering at the rate of 2,400 daily. The day before, Pyongyang, North Korean capital, had been captured by UN troops. 2 hours after Pyongyang was declared secure, members of the 187th Airborne Regiment dropped from planes 33 miles above Pyongyang and about 75 miles from the Manchurian border. South Korean troops drove westward to link up with the paratroopers. On the east coast, South Korean troops had taken Wonsan with unexpectedly light resistance and were advancing far to the north. Disintegrating communist troops were attempting to flee to the Manchurian border. There was still fighting ahead, but at this time it appeared that the Korean War was, as General MacArthur phrased it, definitely coming to an end.
The term "not for the weak or faint-hearted," that's inscripted on a sign right outside of Camp Rogers.
It's beneficial for all soldiers to attend and attempt to learn the Ranger Tab. The reason being is, one, it lets them become a better leader. Also, it teaches them the basics of infantry tasks and battle drills, which they will use in the future. And additionally, it will help save lives on the field because they can train those soldiers on those tasks, and if they have to, they can execute them flawlessly.
Any and all pre-Ranger courses, whether it be 1st Armored Division, 82nd, it's extremely beneficial for soldiers in those units, and not only helping them get to Ranger School, but give them a better idea of what are the things that they can expect and hopefully get them the training that they're really looking for to push themselves and be challenged for the future.
Pre-Ranger is an important thing to go to for soldiers because it's kind of like the Expert Infantryman's badge or the Expert Soldier's badge. You get a lot of time both getting out of your comfort zone, equipment you really don't want to wear, and practicing things you need to practice. You also get a lot of hands-on time with things you don't usually touch, like the saw, and then you get a lot of experience with small unit tactics.
On 10 February 2024, the class started with 42 candidates and concluded with the 23 soldiers seated here before you today. These 23 soldiers endured numerous physical and mental stressors. As a result of that, they leave here today knowing their physical and mental capabilities. Most importantly, they return to their organization as a better trained leader who can motivate their soldiers to complete the most difficult tasks.
On December 14, 2023, British Army Lieutenant General Andrew Harrison, Deputy Commander of the United Nations Command, passed the torch of leadership to Canadian Lieutenant General Derek McCulley in a change of command ceremony performed at the U.S. Forces Korea headquarters on Camp Humphreys, Republic of Korea. General Harrison's story is a long one, beginning back in the 1980s when he first commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army. After the ceremony, we were afforded an opportunity to sit down with General Harrison and hear his fascinating and incredible recollections from both decades past as well as his recent tenure as the Deputy Commander of the United Nations Command.
All right. Well, thank you so much for meeting with us, General Harrison. From my understanding, you commissioned as a second lieutenant in March of 1987. And then on September 1st of 1989, you joined the Power Rose, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about those early days and what they were like?
Yeah. So I was at university, studying at university, and
I had always known from the very days when I saw the Falklands War on television that I wanted to join the parachute regiment. So I worked pretty hard to try and get through that hurdle and achieved it eventually. And therefore, one of the happiest days of my life when I passed the interesting selection for the parachute regiment and was commissioned into the regiment.
What is that training like? Is it similar to airborne nowadays, or was it a little bit different?
Yeah, it's very similar to what it is now. We have to, once you pass the commissioning course at the Royal Military Academy, which takes a year, part of that is selecting your sort of mental and leadership aptitude. But after you've completed that, then you're taken away, a group of you, to do a series of really sort of tough physical tests that lasts for weeks and weeks and weeks, that is called P Company. And P Company, once you pass that, you are given your red beret, and that enables you then to go on for parachute selection, parachute training afterwards. So for all of us in the parachute regiment, P Company is a big deal, and it's a tough old test.
When did you instruct at Sandhurst, and what was the teaching experience like?
Yeah, I went back to the academy to teach about 7 years after I'd left, and it was a fascinating time. I did a year instructing all 3 terms, so juniors, intermediates, and then the senior term at the academy. And then the college commander asked me if I would be his adjutant. So as a parachute regiment officer, I'm used to being in the field. I'm used to running around with a large pack on my back, but I wasn't used to riding a horse on a parade square and having to ride up steps and doing some of the famous things that the adjutant of Old College has to do. So it was unusual, very interesting, and actually is probably more nerve-wracking than many of the times I've been under fire.
At what point did you get involved with the UN, and how did you begin your time there?
Yeah, interesting. So I was working in main building in London, in the sort of the headquarters of defence, and I knew I was going on to Staff College, and I knew I'd have another couple of years in driving a desk. And my friend was responsible for posting all of the interesting UN jobs around the world. So I went to see him, and I said, "Look, anything interesting coming up?" And he said, "Oh yeah, Sierra Leone's good, and something that looks interesting." And so I worked hard to get myself posted to the United Nations in Sierra Leone, and sure enough, it was pretty interesting.
I would imagine. And I wanted to ask you about Sierra Leone. How did you land in the role of an unarmed military observer for the UN there?
Yeah, the war had just finished, so there was a war between the Revolutionary United Front, a rebel organization, and the government of Sierra Leone. So there was an accord, a peace accord that was signed between the rebels and the government. And my job as United Nations unarmed observer was to go in and sort out the modalities, the arrangements for de-armament, the decommissioning of weapons, and the reintegration of those rebels. And so I was working on that for a few months in one of the most challenging parts of the country, deep in the jungle in West Africa, working and living with the rebels when, unbeknownst to me, the civil war reignited, and I was caught up in the maelstrom that was that civil war.
So when the Civil War began, what were the immediate dangers to yourselves that you and the other observers recognized right away?
Well, we didn't know, because we were so deep in the jungle and comms were so challenging, communications were so challenging, we didn't know it had reignited. So I went to one of the routine meetings that I had as the deputy team leader with the rebel chain of command. and I was totally unaware that this war had restarted and there was fighting going on in other parts of the country. So we went to that meeting, and it was during that meeting that we were kidnapped and subsequently held hostage. So it was a surprise and a shock to the system, and yeah.
So you guys found out in the worst possible way, but they kind of found out at the exact same time. Is that right?
Yeah, they were ahead of us. They were ahead of us probably by about 12 hours. And so when we went to the meeting, I was there to negotiate about the peace accord, which we'd been doing routinely for a couple of months. But they invited us to that meeting with the specific intention of taking us hostage. And they came armed. They swarmed over us. They beat us up. They, bound us, and they dragged us into the jungle. And that's how it all started.
How did you escape your capture from the RUF, and what were those 12 days like?
Yeah, they were awful. I mean, they were really difficult. It's difficult to envisage it at the time because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. But I was initially held in solitary confinement. Then a Russian friend of mine was put in the cell with me. People around us were being killed. We were treated pretty horrifically. The rebels held me as a UK officer responsible for all the ills of colonialization over hundreds of years. The Russian got very badly treated and beaten up because of the impact of the AK rifle and the Hind gunships that the government had used against the rebels. And on 3 occasions we were taken off to be executed. And it was just a horrific time. We were very badly beaten. We were very badly treated. We had no food for 12 days. And Andre, the Russian, and myself and a Pakistani officer, Rafiq, took the opportunity to escape one night. And we climbed off the roof of a building where we were being kept captive. And we managed to escape, ran through the jungle, spent the night traversing the jungle. Even though 2 of us were injured, we managed to get into a compound of Indian soldiers that were armed but were surrounded by rebels. So we had to break into that compound through the rebel lines, which was pretty challenging, and alert the Indian soldiers without getting shot by, if you like, our own UN troops. But they were armed soldiers then. So once we were with them, we were armed, and at least we could defend ourselves. And we then had 3 months of being attacked by the rebels from the outside, but we held them off, and that's how it lasted for 3 months until a special forces operation that rescued us in a remarkable and very brave action that sadly cost the life of one of the operators.
In your escape, you weren't just unarmed. You had no equipment or navigational gear of any sort.
No.
How did you manage to get through the jungle and find this base?
I was reasonably familiar with the landscape because I'd been operating around that region, and I knew roughly where the Indian compound would be. I didn't know what state they would be in, and I didn't know whether they'd been overrun by the rebels. So as we worked through the night, it was super challenging and lots of uncertainty. But because of the way we had been treated and the atrocities that had been committed against people with us, any risk was worth it in comparison to being left where we were. So I'm happy that we made the right decision, but of course the outcome turned out to be good. So it's easy with hindsight.
You told me once you were in Calhoun, it sounds like you were involved in what essentially turned into a 10-week siege. What was your role in defending against the assault and the eventual extraction by the SAS teams?
Yeah, I mean, initially the place we were staying with the Indians was simply a cutting in the jungle that the Indians were defending. But as time went on, we started digging trenches, building communication trenches, cutting down the trees to build overhead protection. The sentries became more effective. We started building sort of Rambo-like traps in the jungle to stop the rebels attacking. And whilst people were wounded and were on the base, we were thank goodness never overrun. So and we were simply defending a small base that became stronger every day as the defenses improved.
How did the SAS get communications to you to let you know that they were coming?
Yeah. Well, I can't confirm it was the SAS, but it was an operation to rescue us. And in a quite remarkable operation, they were the people who we would subsequently deal with. They started negotiating with the rebel group, and we were running out of food by this time, 8-10 weeks into it, so there was no rice left. And so the organization said that they would give the rebels a vehicle if the rebels would then drive that vehicle to where we were and give us the food that was in the vehicle. So that was the plan. But the rebels acting irrationally or in a malevolent way, they drove the vehicle to the edge of our enclave so we could see it, and then proceeded to destroy all the food in front of us in the psychological games that were going on. We were starving, so we waited till 2 nights later, and then a small patrol of 4 Indian soldiers went to try and scavenge any food that they could in the middle of the night. And they brought back a small box which had my call sign on it, Oscar India 2. And in that call sign, the forces that were supporting us had smuggled a sat phone and a number of other bits and pieces. And so that sat phone was given to me, or the box was given to me the next morning, which then enabled me to communicate back to the Special Forces headquarters.
And it was a mix of operators, right? It was Nigerian forces and some others that came to rescue.
Yeah, there were a combination of multinational forces like any United Nations mission. Yeah.
How did that experience prepare you for your current role as a deputy commander of the United Nations Command?
I think that experience was the clearest example in my life where the unexpected happened. I had no idea that the Civil War was going to re-erupt. We were well trained in the context of UK forces, but we were operating independently. And I think from that moment on, I absolutely understood that things can go wrong very quickly, and the worst case scenario can happen. And that was what I learned, and I've always taken that as a lesson. My regimental motto is "Ready for anything," and actually,